general subject for tonight is miracles, but I wanted to start with a few remarks about what's going on at the moment, and then I'll move to a deeper background. First few remarks may not seem to be connected, but I'll show you how they fit together in the end. Since Israel was founded in 1948, we have been surrounded by very large Arab nations. Those Arab nations are divided in a number of ways. Some are rich and some are poor. Rich ones are rich because of oil reserves. Some are Sunni and some are Shiite, which are bitterly at war with one another, as you know from contemporary history throughout the last hundreds of years, and certainly in our times. Some have more secular type radical Muslim dictatorships, and some have more traditional Muslim dictatorships. They're divided in a number of ways. But there's one thing upon which they all agree, and that is there's no place for Israel in the Middle East. They all agree on that. In fact, it is a cardinal belief of Islam that all states must be Muslim states. There's no such thing as a non-Muslim state. The United States of America is illegitimate as a state. Non-Muslims can live in a second-class condition, subject to the rulership of Muslims. That's true everywhere. 1,000 times more so in the heart of the Arab Muslim world. Now, in the Middle Ages, as everyone knows, there were crusades. One of the goals of the crusades was to take control of Jerusalem in the name of Christianity. There were 3 crusades, and they had some success. They were able to invade, beat back the Muslim armies, and take control of Jerusalem. 50 years, 75 years, 100 years. The Muslim attitude was, we'll kick you out. We'll kick you out. It may take time. It may take time, but it doesn't belong to you. It belongs to us. It belongs to Allah. We'll kick you out. And they succeeded in kicking out 3 crusades. Attitude towards Israel is exactly the same. You are a Western, non-Muslim bandit. No non-Muslim country can have sovereignty here. Not anywhere in the world, but certainly not here. So maybe we're not strong enough to kick you out now? All right. We'll just wait until we get stronger. But you're not going to last. There's no such thing as a real peace treaty. There's no such thing as a real cooperation, because ultimately there cannot be a non-Muslim. It's not even that it's Jewish. I'm not tracing this to anti-Semitism. Indeed, for many, many years, the same countries that made war against Israel had small Jewish minorities, and they were not particularly persecuted. But it's against any possibility of there being a sovereign non-Muslim state in the area, and therefore what the Wall Street Journal said 10 years ago, for different reasons, but I think it was quite accurate, they said Israel can look forward to 50 years of war because the Muslim states are not training their children to tolerate a Jewish state in their midst and all the rest. No, it's got to be just a passing fad, and it's going to be wiped out. I think it's very remarkable that since this is something they all agree upon, they couldn't agree upon a concerted, serious action to wipe it out. The worst we had was in '67, when Egypt and Syria and Jordan also, reluctantly, but they did join, and Lebanon, who were willing to put forward efforts to crush Israel. But not Iraq, and not Iran, not Saudi Arabia, and not... Why not? Why not? I think someone's looking for divine providence in the modern times. The fact that the Muslim Arab states surrounding us have not unified and made a concerted effort to destroy the state of Israel is an indication of divine providence. That's one thing. Second thing, with all the emphasis on the current war, people have not noticed a very interesting fact about this year. The rainfall during the winter this year was very poor. Nevertheless, you don't hear anyone saying, save water, don't wash your cars, don't water your lawns, rationing water. We don't even hear about the Israel Water Authority raising its prices. Why not? In previous years, chaval al kol tipa, terrible loss of every drop of water that goes to waste. What happened? I'll tell you what happened. As of now, 1/3 of all of Israel's water is produced by desalination. And there's no limit because the sea is not going to run out of water. There's no limit to how much water Israel can produce by desalination. It'll cost money, but we're not under threat. 10 years ago, when we were suffering terrible drought, the thought was maybe we'll buy water from Turkey. Aside from the dangers involved, who knows how some Arab extremists would want to poison the water. It would be gigantically expensive and very chancy transporting water for a whole country. There's no water line between here and there, transported by ship. You don't hear a word about that anymore. Israel is essentially self-sufficient in water without a lot of rainfall. Now, what's our response to that in spiritual terms? We pray for rain. We think rain is very important. We pray for God's favor that rain should fall on the land of Israel. If it doesn't, we feel that we're in danger. There is a fault that we are subject to say, well, we don't need rain anymore. We have it under control. We have it under control. And then the implication, unspoken perhaps, the implication is, and we don't need God either, because we have it under control. We know how to make it for ourselves. The antidote to that spiritual mistake is to stop and reflect, and how exactly did we achieve the desalination? First of all, who thought it up? And who made it practical? How many engineering breakthroughs were necessary to make it practical? And where did they come from? All of them are God's inspiration. The world isn't on an automatic pilot. The world isn't running by accident. So God is doing two things. Number one, He's providing us with the water, just as He did with rain. But now He's providing us with the water as a spiritual challenge, to see through the illusion that we are controlling it, and to understand that it's also a gift from Him, and we're just as dependent upon Him as we were before. Now, something like the two of these ideas is involved in the current war. Apparently, CNN interviewed a Hamas activist in the United States and asked him, don't you guys know how to aim? 1,250 plus rockets have been shot from Gaza to Israel. There have been some number of wounded and one killed. So he was asked, don't you guys know how to aim? And the answer he got was, we know how to aim, but God is protecting them. So why do you keep shooting? We're waiting for them to fall out of God's favor. And then our missiles will hit. Okay, we have Iron Dome. Iron Dome was invented and developed in Israel. The United States provided funding, for which we are grateful, sincerely grateful. But it's an Israeli planned, developed, executed system. And Iron Dome is pretty sophisticated. When you read that of the 1,250 missiles fired from Gaza, 1,000 could have landed on Israeli soil, 250 just misfired altogether. Of them, Iron Dome shot down about 200. So you think, oh, that's not so good. That's a 1/5 ratio. Why are they so proud of that? The answer is because Iron Dome tracks the missile's trajectory within seconds after being launched and figures out where it's going to land. And if it's going to land in an open area, they don't bother to shoot it down. They just let it land. So they're only shooting at the ones that might land and hurt people. And of those, they're knocking down 85%. That's a pretty good score. Indeed, as many people have commented, it has changed the name of the game. 5 years ago, if Hamas had fired 1,250 rockets at Israel, the sum total would have been hundreds killed, thousands wounded, all over the country. There was no way to protect against it. 1,000 of them land in Israel, and 250 land in inhabited areas, people are going to be killed. But almost all of those that would land in inhabited areas get shot down. So, can we say, well, we don't need God. We don't need God, we got Iron Dome. That's the same mistake as the desalination plants. Who is it that inspired Israel to concoct this system? It's the only anti-missile system working in the world. The only one that can work against locally fired rockets. The only one in the world. Who inspired them? Who made the technology successful? Who supplies us with constant manufacturing facilities to make it possible to manufacture? 3 new Iron Dome batteries came out of the factory this week. Let alone the missiles, which I have been told by people are just endless. They can make them over and over again, and they make them quickly, and we're not going to run out of them. The spiritual challenge is to see this as a divine gift, together with the challenge of understanding that without divine help, we wouldn't have that gift either. And the other half of what I told you, Hamas is dreadfully unpopular in the Arab world. Not one Arab country has suggested that maybe they would come to Hamas's aid. Not even to ship them stuff. Okay, Iran shipped them the stuff at the beginning. It does help them out because they have similar radical ideology. But they're not shipping them anything now. The few missiles that were fired from Syria, there was one missile fired from Syria, several fired from Lebanon because there's a Palestinian group in Lebanon. It's not Hezbollah in Lebanon, they don't dare. They don't dare fire. They have 40,000 rockets. They don't dare fire because they know what the result would be, and they know that Lebanon would clamp down on them right away. Lebanon doesn't want Beirut to be destroyed. And Israel has warned them, if they start, Beirut in 48 hours will be destroyed. So they're keeping quiet. Nobody is helping them. They have been the pariahs of the Arab world for many decades. Many of them remember Black September when they were kicked out of Jordan. And the Jordanian government simply cracked down on them, killed thousands of them, and chased them out. So you have the lack of general support, even though what Hamas wants to do is what officially every Muslim wants to do, destroy the state of Israel. Still they have no support. And second of all, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given us a seemingly natural way to defend ourselves, and our job is to remember where that comes from. And that's part of what's going on now, and how we have to see divine providence in the entire circumstance. The fact that the Arabs can't get together to attack us is just amazing. In 1967, when Israel conquered the West Bank and Gaza down to Egypt, there was a famous picture that was taken, it was before digital pictures obviously, of a town in the Sinai. The center of the town, there was a stone monument with an etched map of the Middle East. This is 1967. And the etched map of the Middle East had no Israel. There was no Israel on the map. What is today Israel was divided between Lebanon and Syria and Jordan and Egypt. It just wasn't there. That's their vision of the Middle East. No Israel. And yet, they have not been able to get together to make a concerted effort to attack and kill us. There was the famous Iran-Iraq war, which carried on for years, and they used poison gas against each other and killed millions on both sides. They could get together to fight a war against each other, but they get together to fight a war to wipe out Israel, they're not able to do it. So I think that if you're looking for the evidence of divine providence in our contemporary circumstances, you want to relate to it in spiritual terms, that's some of the things that you should have in mind. Now, Jewish history, especially in the Tanakh, is replete with miracles. Each one is interesting, and each one has a lesson to teach, but I think that the miracles come in categories. And the categories have lessons to teach as categories, not just as individual cases. So, in Egypt, you have the plagues. The plagues divide up into two groups. There are 4 plagues which are absolutely supernatural. That is to say, they break the laws of nature as we know them. They break them in absolute spectacular terms. Nothing remotely resembling them exists in natural terms. The water of the Nile turns to blood. Water does not turn to blood. And don't tell me it came red, and don't tell me it had a red efflorescence, and so forth and so on. Everybody knows what blood is. People are experienced with blood. People slaughter animals, and people cut themselves. We know what blood is, and it says it's blood, and it's blood. Nothing like that happens in the natural world. You have hail, and each hailstone contained within it fire. You don't find fire in hailstones, period. Darkness, where people, first of all, 3 days and nights of continuous darkness, and people were, the darkness held them fast, as they weren't able to move. Nothing remotely resembling that in nature. And then the last one, death of the firstborn. Medical science does not know of a disease that hits firstborn children. There is no such disease. Now the message in a miracle like that is the Jewish God is more powerful than nature, can interfere with it at will. Nothing holds him back. No barriers to what he can do. That's an important message. The other 6, however, have a different character and have a different message. Let's look at the other 6. You have the frogs. Frogs inundated Egypt. Where did the frogs come from? Did they materialize in the air or grow out of the flower pots? The frogs, the Torah itself says, came from the Nile. Now, that's where frogs breed. Frogs breed at riverbanks. The frogs in the plague came from the same place that frogs always come. Why do we then call it a miracle? Because, number one, the frequency was 100 or 1,000 times as great, and number two, it came exactly when Moses said, and it disappeared exactly when Moses agreed with Pharaoh that it should disappear. That means to say it is a miraculous intensification of an otherwise natural process. It's the Nile that's producing the frogs. The Nile always produces frogs. So the source of the frogs is a natural process, but the natural process is behaving in a supernatural fashion. The same with lice are common, especially in areas of the world where hygiene isn't good. Lice are ubiquitous, they're all over. Many, many people have lice. A certain percentage of the population has lice all the time, 25%. You don't have everyone having lice simultaneously. That you don't have. That's not natural. So the lice are natural lice, but the infestation of lice is much more powerful than ever before. And of course, again, it's when Moses triggers it, linked to Moses as a prophet. Then you have wild animals. Wild animals lose their fear of human beings and come into human habitations and terrorize them. These weren't mythical animals, griffins and pterodactyls, or that depends upon what you think about evolution, and other mythical animals. No, they were lions and bears, which existed in this part of the world, wild at that time. And instead of being in the hills afraid of humans, they lost their fear and they terrorized the human population. So again, it's the same wild animals, but behaving in a way that's uncharacteristic. Cattle sickness. There are cattle diseases. And a certain percentage of cattle die every year, but not all of them all at once. Locusts. Locusts inundated Egypt. How did the locusts enter Egypt? How did they come in? The Torah is explicit. They were blown in by the wind. That's how locusts travel. Yes, they have wings, but their wings will not take them hundreds of miles. They fly, they coast on the wind, and then when they come to a place where there's a lot of food, they use their wings to climb the trees and eat the food. And the Torah predicts it that way. It says they're going to come in, and it says the wind blew all night. In the morning, the place was filled with locusts. So again, the way in which they came is the way locusts always travel. Only the infestation was greater, more powerful than ever before or since. And secondly, it came exactly when Moses triggered it to come. What's the message in this category of miracle? This is not like blood. It's not like death of the firstborn. Here you're using a natural process in a supernatural way. Well, at least part of the message is this. Ancient peoples were polytheistic. Each natural power was in the hands of a god. The god of the sun, god of the moon, god of the wind, god of the sea, god of death, god of victory in war, god of fertility. Each natural process was in the hands of a god. Let's take frogs. Who's in charge of frog production? Which supernatural power runs the frog factory? Call him Q. But for 1 week at least, it was clearly the Jewish God that was running frog production. Because Moses predicted it, and it happened exactly as he predicted. That's because the Jewish God was doing it. So at least for that week, it's the Jewish God that's producing frogs. Well, who's producing frogs the rest of the time? Polytheism had lots of gods, but each god had a different function. There weren't 2 gods of the sun, 2 gods of the wind, 3 gods of the sea, 4 gods of fertility, 5 gods of victory in war. Each function got 1 god. So if you know for sure that it was the Jewish God producing frogs from the Nile on this occasion, the natural thought for a polytheist is, then I guess the rest of the time is the Jewish God also. Just 1 second, let me go through the examples, I'll take a question. Now, if you do that 6 times for 6 otherwise natural processes, they're natural processes, but they are made to perform supernaturally, and it's clear that it's the Jewish God that's making them perform supernaturally, which means that at least on that occasion it's the Jewish God who's engineering cattle sickness, and it's the Jewish God who's engineering the behavior of wild animals, and it's the Jewish God who's engineering the blowing of the wind. The thought then becomes, maybe what we call nature altogether is just more activity of the Jewish God. Just more things that he does. And this makes a gigantic difference, because if you only have the first category, what attitude do you take? Think of this being played out for atheists, which it was. Part of what the Torah says about this sequence is that the Egyptians shall know that I am God, the Egyptians know that I am running the world. The Nile turns to blood. The plague lasts a week. What exactly the plague was and how it lasted a week is an interesting question, but it's not tonight's subject. If you want to know, ask me at the end. Now it turns to blood. And then it doesn't turn to blood. Doesn't ever turn to blood again. It stays water. An Egyptian polytheist will say, I'll bet that the Jewish God snuck up on the Nile and stabbed him in the back. I'll bet that's what he did. Otherwise, Jewish God isn't strong enough to better the Nile. After all, Jewish God did it once and never again, did he? That's because he knows the Nile's on his guard. He knows not to attack now when the Nile is looking, when the Nile's ready for him. And there were 3 weeks of no plague in between each plague. And then God strikes again for a week. And then no. So they say, well, okay. He's capable of some pretty spectacular effects. But notice he rests in between. 3 weeks go by when nothing's happening. So he's like the other gods. They have their strengths. They have their clever moves. They have their sphere of success. And they're limited. And they have to take account of the power of the other gods. And contrary to our belief that the Jewish God, if he existed at all, was powerless, no. The Jewish God is powerful. He can pull things off. He can do things against the other gods who are the gods of nature. But, of course, he's limited. That's a normal polytheistic reaction to the 4 plagues of the first category that we described. Once you get involved in the other 6, the polytheist is under pressure. Because the very activities that he assigns to his own gods are demonstrated, at least on occasion, to be the activity of the Jewish God. And if that's the case, maybe what he calls gods are just the way the Jewish God masks himself when he's operating the world. Maybe the Jewish God is operating the whole world. The other 6 plagues have a much more radical message, much more radical implication, that the whole of what we call nature is God's activity.
How can it be that, let's say these people are, so to speak, connecting with, so to speak, like the secondary person, not going straight to HaKadosh Baruch Hu when they're sacrificing these idols. If these idols, if these are forces in the Olam Ha'Olam, I thought things in those realms don't have free will. So how can they be manipulated? How can they be manipulated to go against the normal order of things?
Let's see. When you want to stop a riot, one of the things that you use is a water cannon. Does the water have free will? No. So how can it be manipulated? How can we manipulate it to fire it out of a cannon at people? Because it operates according to certain rules. Precisely because it doesn't have free will. It doesn't have free will. That's why it can be manipulated. If it had free will, it would be very difficult to manipulate since they're much more powerful than we are. But it doesn't have free will. It doesn't have free will, then it operates according to certain rules. If we are privy to those rules, then we can manipulate them. The logic is the exact opposite. Okay, so now already you can begin to see the 2 categories that I started with concerning our present circumstances, where there are things that look out of the ordinary, things that in natural terms, I talked about natural, political, and economic terms, are difficult to understand, why they don't get together to try to wipe us out. And then there are things which look natural, like human discoveries, where we make use of technology that we've so-called discovered and manufactured and put into our service. But that's also just what we think of as nature. And if nature is God's activity also, so then it's all going to be a matter of divine providence, just as I told you at the beginning. Now this sequence of reasoning is carried out in 2 more steps in even greater detail. The next step is Purim. And it's very significant that the Purim miracle, the book of Esther, took place during exile, in the Babylonian exile. What happened? Let's run through the basic events and let's catalog our reaction to them as if we were there. The book of Esther opens with Ahasuerus throwing a party, a 6-month party. He could teach Los Angeles a thing or two. And everybody's there and full of riches, and at the end he decides to demand the queen should make an appearance, a very degrading appearance, and she refuses, being the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar. And there's a political crisis, and his advisors give him a strategy for eliminating her, and he deposes her as queen. Now, if we had been there and witnessed this, would we have thought of this as a miracle? Why? There's obviously political competition between the king and the queen, and he used a strategy, and in political competition, there are winners and losers, and he won and she lost. That sort of thing happens all the time in politics, especially in despotic politics. So I don't think anybody would have regarded it as a miracle. Okay, they got to find a new queen. They undertake a beauty contest all over the kingdom, and Esther is chosen. You may say, well, what's the probability that Esther will be chosen? What's the probability that any girl will be chosen? With thousands and thousands of girls, the probability that any girl is chosen is very small. That doesn't make it a miracle. Is the lottery a miracle because there are 1 million tickets? No. A lottery is a machine whereby you produce an improbable event. It's a machine that guarantees an improbable event will take place. So when an improbable event takes place, it's no surprise. Don't need any special explanation. A beauty contest, whether it's a criterion for selecting one girl, and one girl is selected, of course it was very improbable she would be selected, but whoever's selected will be improbable that she'll be selected. There's no miracle in that. Esther manages to keep her origins a secret. Now that's pretty strange. She's now the queen of the realm. You think some investigative reporter of the New York Times would dig it up somehow. Okay, it's unexpected. It's not obviously miraculous. There's a plot on Ahasuerus' life. And Mordechai overhears the 2 plotters, and they're speaking a foreign language. It just so happens that Mordechai knows this foreign language, reports it to the queen, and the queen reports it to the king, and they're discovered, and they're hung. Well, actually, there are plots against kings' lives all the time. And the vast majority of them are discovered because otherwise it would hardly pay to be king because you'd have a short life. So there was a plot and it was discovered. The king's life was saved. That's not obviously a miracle. Okay, now we come to the end of the story. Haman wants to have Mordechai hung. Comes into the king's palace, middle of the night. King is up because he can't sleep. He asks for the history book to be brought to him because, as everybody knows, history puts you to sleep. And they're reading and they come across this story that Mordechai saves the king's life. And suddenly the king is struck by his conscience. It's happened 4 years before. Did anything happen to Mordechai? Did we reward him for saving my life? After all, you think it'd be nice to reward people who save your life so as to encourage other people to save your life so you won't die. Okay, it slipped his mind 4 years before. But now he suddenly feels we should have done something. And who's on his way in but Haman to tell the king to kill Mordechai? And the king says to Haman, go and honor Mordechai. Now at this point, I think the reader says, that's too much. That's too much. That's going too far. If you had written this as a novel and tried to sell it to Simon & Schuster, the editor would say, I'm sorry, this isn't believable. The events up to here are believable, but this isn't believable. That's the point of the book. Of course this event isn't believable, because you're looking at it as natural history. No, this isn't natural history. This is clearly a miracle. And then Esther is queen, just in place to save the Jewish people from the threat of annihilation. Okay, that's the way it's going to look to a person who's observing it. Now, let's take this person on a flashback. Now that he's seen that Mordechai survives, and Haman is destroyed, and Esther is the one who saves the Jewish people, and Mordechai becomes prime minister, and they take revenge on their enemies. The Jewish population has to think, well, let's go back to the beginning. How did Esther become queen? Well, there was a Hashverosh's party, and the summons to Vashti, and Vashti refuses to come. It's a political crisis, and then she's removed. Was that really all an accident? That, after all, is how Esther got into her position of being queen to be able to save us. Now it begins to look like that was manipulated from the beginning so as to put Esther there so we could be saved. And was it really an accident that Mordechai overheard the two plotters, and he happens to know the foreign language that they're speaking? And it's reported to the king, and by the way, the verse says, Esther reported it to the king in the name of Mordechai. And the king's life is saved, and it says that the king wrote it down in the book of Chronicles that his life was saved by Mordechai, and the king doesn't give Mordechai any reward for it, and he's only reminded of it 4 years later. Does that look accidental? Since there's an obvious miracle that God saves Mordechai's life, what led up to that miracle was exposing the plot and having it written in the history book, and the king not rewarding him. All that now looks like it was prepared by divine providence for this outcome. What you have here is an extremely important mental exercise. You live through events that look natural, and then because of later developments, you go back and reinterpret those events and say they weren't really natural. They weren't really accidental. They really were divine providence. I can see now, retrospectively, that they were really divine providence. That's very important, because if that happens to you, if it's vivid, then you might take that lesson and apply it forward. When an event takes place and you don't know the reason for it, you don't see what God's interested in it is, you say, well, I've been through this already. I had a whole sequence of events that I thought were natural and accidental, and then retrospectively I had to realize that they were divine providence. This one here that I can't explain now also probably is divine providence, and I can't explain it. I just don't know what the divine providence in it is. This leads to a deeper perspective on the events that take place that look as if they were natural events. As I say, it's very important that this took place in exile, because exile is precisely a time in which God is not manifesting himself visibly. There aren't continuous miracles like there were in the temple, the first temple, which accompanied us all the time. You could go to the temple and see these miracles taking place. There was some minimal prophecy, but not nearly the prophecy that there was in the land of Israel. And it was coming to an end. The manifestation of God in the world was very much reduced. And therefore, a miracle teaching you how to appreciate that events that look natural and accidental are really Divine providence was a very important lesson under those conditions. Okay, that's step 3. You had 2 categories of plagues in Egypt, and this is step 3. And step 4 is the miracle of Hanukkah. The miracle of Hanukkah carries this idea even further. You know the story. The Assyrian Greeks, together with a large percentage of Jews who became Hellenized, imposed Hellenistic culture and Hellenistic Greek religion on a large segment of the country, to the extent they performed abominations in the temple. Then there was a revolt, which started off as a small guerrilla war, and then spread to larger sections of the population, and eventually chased the Assyrian Greeks out and defeated other Jews who represented the Hellenistic idea. The temple was cleaned out, a menorah was set up, and one night's oil lasted for 8 nights. Let's ask this question. Maharal asked this question. The war of this guerrilla band against the trained professional Assyrian armies, which the guerrillas won, was that miraculous? Was it an open miracle? Did boulders fall down from heaven on the Assyrian Greek soldiers? Did the earth open up and swallow up the soldiers? Did boiling oil come rolling out of the hills and fry them alive or boil them alive? Says the Maharal, no. The war, at least to what you could observe, was a purely naturalistic war. You'll tell me, but doesn't it say that it was the few that conquered the many, the weak that conquered the strong? Yes, that's what it says. Is that really unheard of in history? If you're not from Great Britain, then I can proudly say to you that the United States of America defeated the British in the Revolutionary War. The British, who were trained professional soldiers, and the Americans were ragtags hiding behind trees with coonskin caps and ready-made rifles and so forth and so on, and they defeated the great British. Okay, and if you're a proud American, I'll remind you about Vietnam, where the American firepower and professional soldiers and all that were orders of magnitude superior to the Vietnamese, and the Americans lost. It's not unheard of that a smaller, weaker guerrilla band fighting at home for freedom of its home territory defeats a foreign enemy, or basically mercenaries paid to attack. That's not unheard of in natural terms. Says the Maharal, if you were attached to the Maccabean forces and observed the battles, you would not see anything unnatural. You would see heroism, you would see dedication, you would see imagination, but nothing obviously unnatural, nothing obviously miraculous. Now, they're conducting the war. The war was spurred by action of priests, because among other things, the Syrian Greeks offered a pig in the temple, which for us is a gigantic abomination. They did other things as well. That's what sparked the revolt. And the revolt was from south to north. On the way north, they conquered Jerusalem, and they cleaned out the temple. The campaign went on for months afterwards. It wasn't over when they conquered Jerusalem. They conquered Jerusalem, cleaned out the temple, and one of the things they did was set up a menorah. And by the way, if you have read correctly that the menorah was solid gold, it doesn't have to be solid gold. It can be made of wood or tin or anything else. Of course, they conquered it. They didn't have gold to make the menorah out of. So the one says they made it out of wood. The other one says they made it out of some base metal. They set up a makeshift menorah right away. And that night, they lit the menorah. Now, they looked for oil. They looked for pure oil. They found one container of oil with the seal of the high priest. There's an infinity of Torah about this story, and I'm not going into it tonight. I just want to get to one detail. And it was enough to last one night. They filled the menorah with all the oil, as according to law you have to do. You can't say, since we only have one night's worth, and it'll take us about a week to provide new oil, that will only put in 1/7 as much or 1/8 as much. No, you can't do that. They put it in, of course, one night's worth of oil burned for 8 nights. How did they understand that? How did they interpret that? Well, they said, we undertook this battle for God's glory. We undertook it because we could not tolerate the way God's sanctity and God's Torah were being trampled underfoot. And God is signaling us that He's with us. Because The religious gesture is where there is an immediate, open miracle. And not only did they take this as a signal of approval from God, but they used this miracle, I'm quoting the Maharal now, this is his analysis of the event. They used this to look more deeply at the military battles and to understand that what appeared to be a naturalistic victory was really God's providence enabling them to do it. What's troubling you is that the word miracle has two meanings, and it's
Double entendre.
yes, it is a double entendre. I'll tell you why. Because sometimes the word miracle means something that is obviously and openly a divine action. Then the words hidden miracle are simply an oxymoron. They're a contradiction per se. But since I put the title of the lecture, Open and Hidden Miracles, that's not the meaning that I'm using. And in our literature, there are both meanings. One is an event that's openly and obviously a divine action. That's very, very seldom. That's the crossing of the Red Sea. That's the plagues in Egypt, but it's very seldom. There's another use of the word miracle, which is an event that is divine agency. But that could be open or hidden. God can hide his agency also. And by putting that title on the advertisement, that's the usage of miracle that I'm using tonight. In our literature, we have both. Sometimes the same author in the same book uses both. So you have to be very careful when you're reading what exactly it's meant. It's something which is direct divine agency. That's why I equated miracle in my speaking with divine providence. And this is a question of direct divine providence. They didn't attribute it to nature, to natural causes, or they understood, you weren't here from the beginning, but they understood that what we call nature is God's activity anyway, and that includes human success, is also God's activity. That being the case, the miracle of the oil caused them to interpret, to understand, to perceive their military victory as God's providence also. And this solves a very famous problem in the holiday of Hanukkah, which was first raised by the Beis Yosef about 500 years ago. And since he raised it, there have been hundreds of proposed answers. But this gives a very deep answer. It's not mine. It's found in the literature. Because if you have 1 night's worth of oil, which burns for 8 nights, how many miracle nights are there? Only 7. Because the oil was 1 night's worth all by itself. So if the miracle was only 7, why do we celebrate the miracle for 8 nights? That's the Beis Yosef's question. Beis Yosef is the author of the Shulchan Aruch. One nice answer to that question is that the first night is not celebrating the miracle of the oil. The first night is celebrating the hidden miracle of the military victory. And that solves another problem, which I think forces you into this corner pretty much, because Maimonides says, what was the date on which they reconquered Jerusalem and cleaned out the temple? The 25th of Kislev. That's how they take the word Hanukkah. Chanu means they came to rest. Kafhei, which is 25. They conquered and took possession of the temple on the 25th of Kislev. Okay, when is the menorah lit? The menorah is lit at night, in the evening. Well, if you took repossession of the temple on the 25th, and you lit the menorah in the evening, on what date did you light the menorah? The 26th. But if we lit the menorah on the 26th, why then do we start lighting the Hanukkah lamps on the night of the 25th, 24 hours earlier? Earlier than when they lit the menorah in the holiday of Hanukkah, when it happened. Answer, because the first lighting is not for the oil. The first lighting is for the military victory. And that's part of the miracle. Another proof of it, if you look carefully at the section that we add to the Siddur on Hanukkah, in the prayers and in the benching after the meals, a whole long section that describes what happened on Hanukkah, there isn't a mention of the oil. Not a mention of the oil. The whole text is about the military victory. Not a word. And even stranger than that, even more astounding than that, when you go to light the menorah, there's a paragraph to say, Hanerus hololu, anu madlikim, al nisim, al niflos, etc., etc. There's a paragraph that you say just before you light the menorah. the only miracle mentioned in that paragraph is the war. The miracle of the oil isn't mentioned when you're about to light the menorah celebrating the miracle of the oil. It's astounding. Says the Maharal, because the tradition didn't want you to get lost in the oil. Don't get lost in the oil. The oil is the open miracle. It's important, it's spectacular, you're naturally drawn to it, there's a lot of literature on it. Don't get lost in the oil. Recognize that one of the chief functions of the oil was to direct your attention to the military victory, and to understand that that was also divine providence. That divine providence is sometimes open and obvious and sometimes hidden, and you are challenged to constantly keep in mind that what we think of as nature is also an expression of divine providence. So, to come back to where we started from, the fact that Iron Dome is doing such a spectacular job protecting our cities, protecting our lives, should not be thought of as, oh, then we don't need God's protection because we have a piece of technology. We should be doubly thankful that God made that technology possible. I'll give you one little hint as to how to keep this sort of thing in mind. Think of your own experience in solving a problem, a really difficult problem. Often enough, it happens like this. What am I going to do? So I think about it this way, I think about it that way, and I read this book and that book, and I talk to people. Nothing comes up. So I think, what am I going to do? Now, if I don't have any other plans or any other sources, some people who are very dogged, very focused, go through all of them again. All the same ones again. If nothing comes up, they go through all of them a third time. Because experience has taught them that going back through all the failed strategies, sometimes they come up with a solution. Now, how could that be? You're going through the failed strategies. The answer is, no one of us has a clue how that can be. It just happens. We know it happens. And since we know it happens, we have expressions which reflect this. You know, the idea hit me. The light bulb goes on. It struck me that. All those words are very indicative. They are describing an external force. Hit me, struck me. That's something coming in from the outside. That's how you experience it. Of course, you are taught not to take that seriously. You're taught to think it's just a hidden brain circuit that I wasn't firing before and so on and so on. But you don't know that. You experience it as coming from the outside. The truth is, it is coming from the outside. That brilliant idea that just hits you, you didn't have a process for developing it. You didn't have a strategy, okay, every time I do this strategy, I get an idea at the end, so I know how to do it. No. It hits you from the outside. A spiritually aware person says, that's a gift. That's a gift. God is tapping me on the shoulder and giving me a gift. He's not only provided me with the idea, but he's taken away the veneer of my control and my production so that I could face it as a gift. The first Shabbaton that Rosh Sameach ran in the United States 33 years ago, the fellow who ran it, I was teaching there, but somebody organized it, and he sent out advertising of various kinds. When it was over, he gave a questionnaire to each of the participants and asked them, how did you hear about the program? And they wrote down how they heard about it. Not a single one heard about it from his advertising. Not one. So when he told me this, he said, do you think my advertising was superfluous? Not at all. My job is to make an effort. My job is to use my intelligence to make an effort. God always produces the results. Only here he did me a double favor. He produced the results, and he didn't let me fall into the trap of thinking that I produced the results. I'm doubly grateful. Of course, God is also telling you, don't use those means anymore. Use different means. You're supposed to use your intelligence. But you're supposed to preserve your awareness that the results are always delivered by divine providence. This is the hidden message of miracles in our tradition, many of them, that you're supposed to not focus solely, not get lost in the miracle itself, but to pay attention to the implications of the miracle, to the seemingly natural, to understand that it is a production of hidden miracles.
I mean, isn't that like sort of the paradox between like religiosity and sort of Brooks Spinoza's God? I mean, Brooks Spinoza thought God solely existed within nature. I mean, what you're describing is the difference between the Maccabees battle, right? The hidden miracle versus like the open miracle, right? The open miracle is just an ontology to really illustrate that ultimately whatever happens is truly you're not in control. Hashem's sort of orchestrating the events. I mean, I think that's what differentiates secular thought versus religious thought. Religious thought believes there's some sort of spiritual aspect associated with things, even though the Rambam tends to go more toward the logical side. I mean, at the end of the day, it's...
I certainly cannot agree with your vocabulary. The Rambam's logic includes miracles all the way through. And for example, Maimonides says, every pain you suffer is a punishment for a transgression, and every pleasure you get is reward for something good you did. That's not nature. Now, I regard that as supremely logical. I don't contrast logic and miracle, so I don't hear that if you die in miracles, you're more logical. But this is Maimonides talking. Every pleasure, every pinprick on your finger is a punishment for something you did wrong, and every lick of an ice cream cone is a reward of something you did right. And that's not natural. So I think there's a lot of.
Yeah.
If you got it from Wikipedia, it's probably not correct in this respect. They don't do an in-depth study. And Maimonides was not an Aristotelian. Even the Stanford Encyclopedias of philosophy got that right. I was shocked that the article on Maimonides in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is the cat's meow in philosophy, says many people have painted Maimonides as an Aristotelian, but it's not true. He was not an Aristotelian, and that is in fact correct. And they got that right. So I think what you've heard, which seems to come from certain types of sources, it needs to be put. I think a question mark has to be put around the things that you're saying. But the difference between the two types of miracles is not obvious. One could have had the picture that you associate, I think falsely with Maimonides, that God created the world, went on vacation, left it on its own, and from time to time, when necessary, mixes in to change things.
I think the Ramchal would agree with that. Like typically,
certainly not. No Kabbalist could possibly agree with that.
No, in my body, like the Ramchal, like he says, the only time, like typically God exists within nature, and then the only time open miracles happen is like with like for example the when we're leaving Mitzrayim. At that particular point, God intervenes within nature.
Yeah, but you see, your vocabulary, I think, betrays a certain tension, because in talking about what he did, you used the word open for miracles. What we call nature, as the Chazon Ish wrote, nature is a word for the more constant divine activity. Right. But then it's not that it works within nature. Nature is just a name for a certain type of divine activity.
No, I agree with you 100%.
Oh, but then there's no contrast here. God is doing it all.
But
right?
it's the perception, there's a concept in psychology, the perception of the observer.
That's 100% true. That's 100%. But you didn't say anything till this moment about perception of the observer. Rav Dessler writes about this in detail. What we call nature is something that God acts in a certain pattern so that we will have a certain perception of it, and then we have to be trained to overcome that perception. I mean, the whole purpose of creation, according to Ramchal, is Gilui HaYichud. And Gilui HaYichud means that God is everywhere in everything, just you don't see it and you have to reveal it where it is. So there's no such thing as nature operating on its own.
No, but I hear you. But the thing is, I think that's what changes someone from a secular standpoint for a religious standpoint. It depends what you view as the particular observer. Do you see this as a natural event? Like, for example, it's just natural, just happened, it just is, it's just an event? Or is there some sort of, act associated with it? When you look at it, you see a picture of divinity, in which case you look at everything from that perspective. You go to the core belief, Hashem is oneness, essentially, that Hashem is ultimately controlling
and operating everything. That's quite true. But then there's no nature in Maimonides, there's no nature in Ramchal. They're all talking about different aspects of divine activity. Okay, so at any rate, my goal from the beginning this evening was to orient you to what's going on now and to try to see it in spiritual terms. That is the constant challenge. The constant challenge is to relate to the world in a spiritual way, and we're now under attack. We're now fighting a war, and there's a natural tendency to be drawn into the strategy and the materials and the technology and all the rest, and to lose sight of the fact that this is really a divine exercise. And our leverage is to respond to it in terms of the divine will.